Okay. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day that you've given us to just worship you. We are grateful that it is a celebration Sunday, so we are looking forward to those who will be baptized, confessing their faith publicly, those who will be joining the church through membership, and just parents who are willing to dedicate their babies to you, Lord. We recognize that you are God who's the only one worth following, committing to, and I just pray that, as a community, we can help pull each other along down that road of being believers and followers of Jesus Christ, Lord. I pray that you give me the wisdom to share what needs to be shared in this discipleship class, and may you facilitate the conversation by the power of your Holy Spirit. Bless it. May the fellowship be edifying to all of us and glorifying to you, Lord. And we do this all for you. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, great. So we do have some new people that weren't here last time. So just as a recap, let me ask you guys, why have you come to this class? What are you hoping to get out of it?
I answered last week.
The new people, yeah.
Sorry.
This is what we did last week, so I just did.
Well, I do love to disciple people.
Okay.
And so I want to, just learn more about how I can effectively do it, and I was very excited when I heard that you had come on, and I was like, oh gosh, it's just like my little niche. So I'm just really eager to see what it is you have to offer, and I'm open to what God would have on me.
Yep. Thanks for sharing. Hi, Rich.
Matt, how are you?
Good. You can grab a packet. If you already have a writing utensil, great, and a blank piece of paper.
There you go. Send it down, a nice guy, Rich. And what do you know?
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, if you haven't already written your names on your packet, please do, so I know who to hunt down in case I see them linger. And just as I told people last week, I'm a fairly low-tech guy. It stems back to pharmacy school, where I was one of the few pharmacy students that refused to bring a laptop to class. I wrote all my notes by hand, and I just feel like it helps people process things better, and it helps with memory retention. So that's why I have this as well. Plus, I feel like it's helpful for people to get an idea of where we're headed down these next, what's going to be 5 weeks. If you look through it, you'll see that we're going to spend the first half of our time together talking about theory and big picture stuff when it comes to discipleship. And towards the latter half of these 5 weeks, we will talk more about more practical things of nature. So there are appendices there for you to reference, and there's one appendix that I forgot to include, but I will have it to you by the end of the 6 weeks. We have source material that are there, which I am referencing in these sessions. So if you want to know more, feel free to look at those references. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them during this time. I'm not going to be too stringent about that. Even though I value time, I also value participation and interactiveness. So, yes. Now, for those who weren't here, just to recap what we talked about last week, we talked about a few things, general items. We kind of talked about, what does a healthy church look like? And what is a healthy church really meant to do? And we looked at scriptures in Matthew for that. We talked about the church being a salt and light in the world, and which means that it's supposed to be distinctive and it's meant to spread in its surroundings. Salt adds flavor to whatever is being added to, and it's also preservative. But at the same time, when we take into consideration light that spreads in the darkness, light that's noticeable in darkness, light spreads. And we achieve that ultimately through the Great Commission, where we are called to make disciples of all nations. When you make disciples, people who are distinct from the world, and people who make other disciples, you preserve, you are distinct, and you spread. Last week we also looked at different church models that lend themselves to different focuses, whether it be biblical evangelism, biblical education, biblical action, or biblical relationships. Now, these church models are not necessarily bad in and of themselves, But because of their very specific focus, they could be skewed in certain aspects in the long run, which is why when it comes to the churches that focus on biblical discipleship, which encompasses all those aspects, you have a more well-rounded approach to church. Then we dive into a working definition of what is a disciple, which we used from Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, where Jesus, when he first invites his disciples, he says to them, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men." And when you look at that verse, there are three components that he kind of lays out there when it comes to being a disciple. And don't worry if you're not catching everything that I say, you can always record. I mean, you can always watch the recording. So if your idea of note-taking is transcribing everything I say, then you have the video to fall back on. But anyways, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. So ultimately, when it comes to disciple making and who's a disciple is someone who's actively following Jesus, someone who's actively being transformed by Jesus, and someone who's actively participating on the mission with Jesus. So those are the three components when it comes to what makes up a disciple. What does a disciple look like? And then because of that definition, we realize that Jesus is integrated in every step when it comes to being a disciple and the disciple-making process. And we've concluded that clearly Jesus is the best disciple maker in history. So what was it that he did that gave him that, I guess, essential title, that he could be characterized that way? And there's a formula from at the end of session 1 that I concluded with, which was an intentional leader plus a relational environment plus a reproducible process equals an infinite number of disciples. So today we're going to begin examining that formula, focusing on the first part, an intentional leader. Now this could potentially bleed into the next week or so before we get to the relational environment factor, but that's okay. I feel like with the way that these sessions are laid out, whether we go a little bit over, a little bit under, that's totally fine. That's the benefit of having these laid out sessions, so we can kind of plan around that. So having said all that, I have an opening question for you. And this, you don't have to use a piece of paper. Can you think of a person in your life who you consider a great leader? And what was it about that person which will lead you to characterize them that way? So take a minute to think about a person that you, in your life, who you would consider a great leader. And then why would you consider them that? And whoever wants to kick off their responses, feel free. Yeah.
Kick it off. Bill Cunningham, Newport Beach, California. My boss, longtime boss from 1973 until I left in 2000. Sweet old Bill, loved by everybody. He ran the entire department. His management style was MBWA, management by walking around. He walked around, he knew everybody, he knew their name, knew their families, hung out with them. Everybody thought Bill was their best friend. But to answer the question, that's just his style, his personality. He is a person that knows and believes it, okay? And whatever it was, the business model to make our team successful. He shares and promotes it. He lives and models it. He corrects it and follows up, keeps everybody on track, and he rewards or punishes. He's like a big overseer parent.
Yeah. No, that was
That's
great.
Bill Cunningham.
And you worked for Bill for quite a few years there, so
Yeah.
I guess that speaks a lot.
28 years.
I think a good leader needs to listen to the people, listen to the people that he's working with or whatever, but he also needs to be able to make decisions for the good of whatever it is, without worrying about what everybody's thinking. I think they need to stand apart stand up and say, this is, in humility,
Mhm.
not with, you know, dictatorship, like, but with humility. So, I think of Pastor Nick, I love working with him, because he would listen to everything I had to say, but he would, then he would make the decision, you know, be able to make the decision, you know, good leader needs to, yeah.
Nick, did you hear that?
And I love that.
Thanks for sharing. Anyone else?
I only worked with him for a brief while when I was heading the men's fellowship committee to prepare for a retreat. But Lee Rankin was a great leader. He got me to do things that I didn't think I could do, and you know, without me realizing what he was doing until after the fact. And he got me to do them a lot better than I thought I could do. So he was a very good leader. I was in charge of the committee, but
Okay.
I considered him to be the leader because of his thoughts and words and you know how he helped direct things.
Thanks for sharing. Anyone else? Well, for me, one that comes to mind is a professor I had at seminary. He was actually technically my first professor there because I took summer classes. So I took summer Greek first, just because it's been a while since I was in school and I wanted to kind of warm up my brain, so to speak. So I figured I would take a language to start off my seminary career. And a lot of people would say that you were nuts for taking a summer language there, but I wanted the challenge. And this professor, he was the type that not only taught, but he was one who was willing to invest in his students. One who was willing to spend time with the students, to explain things, to give advice if you needed to be given advice to. And for me, I spent enough time with him to not only understand why I was there in his class, but by the end of his class, not only had I had a passion for what he taught, but I myself had developed the skills to kind of teach others the same thing. I wanted to teach others the same thing because I wanted them to develop the same passion that I developed in his class. So, and it was Greek first, and then I followed up with his New Testament exegesis. And it came to a point where I was his unofficial TA, you know, down the road, when I had the actual flexibility to do that, where I would teach students in my free time methods of exegesis that I learned in his class. And I was like, he taught me to see the Bible in a certain way, and I wanted others to see the Bible the same way as well. Not to say that everyone wants to see the Bible the same way, but at the very least, the revelations that I got, the things that I was enlightened with as I read the Bible with the way he taught, I wanted to give people that chance as well, and I taught them. So yeah, so I thought he was a great leader, especially in that context. And even though I don't have as many years of experience with people as some of you may have, I've thought a lot about this topic, and I've read a lot about this topic, and I've watched a lot of videos about this topic, sometimes even TED Talks. And I've come to realize that when it comes to what makes a great leader, at least from different points of view, there are some things that people say that have in common, things that trend. The idea that a leader knows his people. He knows his people. He knows them well enough, or at least if he doesn't at first, he gets to know them well enough to be able to maximize their potential, right? A leader is someone who knows the game, knows it, right? Knows the mission at hand, what needs to be accomplished. And a leader, he's able to foster an environment of trust, unity, teamwork, so that people will actually be able to fulfill that mission, to accomplish it. So from all those things that I've read, experienced, or watched, those seem to be common links when it comes to what makes a great leader who he or she is. And the source material that I am drawing from in the references likes to use the idea of a coach in sports, because the guy himself, he was a coach in the past as well. So a coach, if you think about it, is someone who can help their players eventually become veterans who know how to win games. And not only does he keep it there, not only are they veterans who know how to win games, but eventually they become veterans who know how to teach newer players or younger players how to become veterans who wins games as well. That's how you know signs of a good coach. Now let me ask you this. Do you know the difference between a high school football coach and a collegiate football coach, besides the salary? and airtime on TV? Anyone want to take a guess? And what a very tangible, noticeable difference between them is?
Could it be I don't actually know. I don't know.
Do you want to take a sports guess?
Like you need a certain amount of experience.
Certain amount of experience. Well, yes, that could be a factor. But I was thinking more along the lines of collegiate coaches. They have the luxury to go around the country to recruit. You know, they have the option, depending upon the school, to pick the best of the best. You know, so I always wonder when I'm watching some college sports, how did this person from New Jersey end up in California? You know, or how did this person from New Jersey end up in Tennessee? You know, where was Rutgers? So collegiate coaches have the option and luxury to recruit the best of the best. People who, not to say that they're already arrived, but they're way more developed than, let's say, other players in your local community. But high school coaches, they don't really have that luxury. They work with those who are zoned for their high school. So they have to work with the guys that they have. And so they have to groom them to the point there, maybe they arrive to the point where they are, maybe they don't start as a 5-star recruit, but high school coaches have to raise a person to the point where they could potentially be a 5-star recruit, where college coaches, right away, they could work with a 5-star recruit, if that makes sense. So let me ask you this. In a church context, these two different approaches can play a role, right? But which of these roles would you say should be practiced more in the church? And why would you say that?
Well, it depends.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think when looking for staff members,
Mhm.
you should have a collegiate mindset,
Yeah.
where you want a 5-star recruit.
Right.
But when making disciples, you want a high school atmosphere where it's all about the community.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking, that there are certain situations that will lend itself to the collegiate mindset, whereas other situations leads itself to the high school mindset. And the fact of the matter is, what happens if you skew one way or the other? What are some downfalls in skewing one way or the other?
Improper leadership, if you skew more towards, if you hire somebody who's maybe not as qualified, and then maybe your standard is too high for just the people in your church and they can't live up to what you have set for them.
Yeah. We want people to be well qualified when they're in leadership, you know. But at the same time, we don't want people to think that I'm not a pastor, so I can't lead a small group. You know, I'm not a pastor, so I can't go into this Bible study with someone else, right?
Yeah.
So that's things to take into consideration when it comes to, you know, how should we approach leadership on multiple levels, especially in the church setting.
I think it's more important to focus at the lower level, because if you focus on making the leaders great leaders, then you end up with the extreme 80-20 version of a church.
Yeah. Because a lot of times churches are built from the ground up, right? Even though a lot of times they're run from top down. And we don't want to come to a situation where, like you said, the 80-20 angle, right? Where 80% of the church is not participating for whatever reason. But at the very least, we don't want to give them another reason to think that they shouldn't participate or serve, which is they are not qualified to do that. You know, we want to take that hindrance aside. So now that we're talking specifically about a church context, an intentional leader is someone who's very purposeful and in their choices and actions. But everything that they do doesn't always have to be about business, right? You don't. Not everything has to be a Bible study. Not everything has to be turn into a counseling session. Sometimes it's okay to get together, to have fun, to fellowship, to just enjoy each other's presence, to learn more about each other. But an intentional leader will always have the end game in the back of their mind. And what is that end game? Well, we kind of alluded to it in the previous session and in the recap, which is for us to be salt and light, for us to have that great commission in the back of our minds. The intentional leader or coach understands the game that we are playing is called discipleship. All right? But what, in regards to this game, is a leader, intentional leader supposed to do? So I have some points laid out there. They're to understand the nature of the game of discipleship. They are to evaluate the players, and they are to create relational environments for people to work or to grow. So the first part, understanding the nature of the game of discipleship. So this is where you would ask the questions, what are the basic rules of the game? Why are we playing the game? Who's involved in this game? What roles do different people play? Those are some of the basic questions that you ask when it comes to understanding the nature of the game. And those are kind of similar questions that you would ask when you're trying to understand the nature of anything, really. Who, what, when, where, why. So to kind of get a better understanding of the nature of the game, can I have 3 volunteers to read different passages? Can I have one person turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2? One person go to Hebrews 5, verses 12 to 14.
Hebrews what?
Oh, he's got Hebrews.
Oh, you got Hebrews what?
So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2.
Hebrews 5.
Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 to 14. And then 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. And these are all verses that are listed later on in that same session. They're under, when we look at the different spiritual stages of growth, there are verses listed there, and these are some of those verses. So if you want, you can underline those verses or whatnot. But they're verses that I'm highlighting for this purpose right now. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, and 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 to 2. So can I have a volunteer to read each of those verses? So John's got Peter,
I'll do.
you got Hebrews. Do I have a volunteer for Timothy? Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, starting with 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2. I'm going to start in 1 because it flows right
Sure.
into 2 in my translation. It says,
Totally fine.
Therefore, putting aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, here we go, this is 2. Like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. And I'm going to stop with 3. If you have tasted the kindness of the Lord.
Thank you.
They all flow together.
Hebrews 5:12 to 14 reads, For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the world of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil.
Thanks.
Okay, 2 Timothy 2, 1 to 2. You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others.
Thank you. So, when we take in each of these specific passages, is there any underlying theme or link that you can see kind of tying them all together, and why it might be relevant for the idea of discipleship?
Growth.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Richard. Growth. Because we go from an infant to a child who should be on solid food but is still on milk. And Lynn, she highlights a passage where someone's talking to their spiritual son, which indicates that the person who's talking is a spiritual father. So when it comes to the idea of life of a believer and a follower of Jesus, there's meant to be spiritual growth. There's supposed to be a progression in maturity. You go from one stage to the next, to the next, to the next. And we saw that progression in these verses that were read one after the other. That is why we are playing the game of discipleship. And we actually already established in the previous session that discipleship is a lot like spiritual parenting, especially from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 to 9. And spiritual parenting requires a time and proximity commitment from the person who's doing it to the person who's on the receiving end. You need time and proximity, that kind of investment in order to do the spiritual parenting, as I'm sure any parent here would attest to when it comes to physical, biological parenting, time and proximity. You're meant to walk alongside them as they're maturing in Christ so they can eventually do that for others. So that is the nature of the game. Now, however, even though you may be acting as a spiritual parent, bringing them along, and at times it feels like you're the only one who's responsible for the outcome of this person, right? Because you're the spiritual parent, you're probably the most visible discipleship force in their lives, or the largest growth factor in their lives. It may seem that way, but in actuality, it's a team effort. And the responsibility of a person's growth, a person's progressing in maturity, a person's discipleship actually falls on the shoulders of three. And I have the three laid out there in the the outline. You got the disciple maker, the person being discipled, and God. So you got your part, assuming that you're a disciple maker, or if you're not a disciple maker, maybe you're a disciple. You have your part in this process. And then there's God. So for the first part, the disciple maker, can someone read Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 to 6?
Got it.
Thanks.
Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. To 5, you said?
6.
Okay. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone.
Thanks. So we see here that Colossians 4, 2 to 6, we see the exhortation of intentionality, right? The exhortation of you as a person who's going to be helping this younger believer, you as a person who's going to be the disciple maker, you are meant to be intentional. And to be intentional is someone who is prayerful and someone who's practicing wisdom. So you're not haphazardly doing anything, and you're not hastily doing anything. You are with wisdom, acting as God is moving you. And hopefully you know how God is moving you because you're being prayerful about it.
I wrote some notes in here and it said watchful means to be alert, like
Yes.
to be really alert. And then the season with salt, thirsty for what we have in Jesus. That's what, the final outcome is what
Yes.
we want for them, so,
No, exactly.
yeah.
Last week when we were having this discussion, I talked about when you are a person who's being more intentional, you are going to have a different mindset than you did before. You will be more alert to certain topics that come up in conversations, right? Maybe someone mentions something that you think right away, this could be a gospel conversation. That this, if a person's talking about suffering, if a person's talking about, oh, how could this person do this? That lends itself to having an even deeper conversation. So that comes with wisdom, and hopefully the reason why it came about is because you were prayerful about it. Maybe it's a person that you have. It's funny because in a previous church, someone told me that there was a person who, with their neighbor, took walks all the time, every day. Took walks. But this person who they took walks with was a non-believer, and they never wanted to have these kind of spiritual conversations because they knew that if they opened that door, that'd be Pandora's box, right? But the person from church knows that one day something was happening in this person's life. I think something happened with their kids, right? So it was a very difficult time for this person, and the person from church took that as an opportunity to go even deeper, to talk about suffering, to talk about the idea of children and faith and things of that nature. But it took many walks of listening and discernment, but also times of prayer prior to that. So intentional leader is someone who is praying and who's watching, and just notice that these opportunities that God grants us are preceded by wisdom and prayer. So things to keep in mind. And for anyone who wants to have an idea of what wisdom looks like, you can look at James chapter 3, verse 17, which I'll read. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. James 3:17. That is what wisdom from above looks like. Now, if you're the disciple maker, great. That's your role. That's your part. But not everything falls on you. Some of it falls on the person that is on the receiving end. So the person being discipled. Ultimately, it is their responsibility to respond. You know, we can't grow for them, and we can't force them to grow, as is evident with the rich young ruler, which we went over last month, right? The opportunity could be laid there before them, but if they don't want to take it, that's really up to them. But don't be discouraged, because you know there are a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes, obviously, with the next part that we don't notice. Maybe the timing is not right? Maybe your conversation with them where you were shot down is just one of many future conversations that are needed to peel away the layers of the onion that is their heart, right? Or perhaps you're not the person to bring them over the threshold, right? Maybe God has someone else down the line that's intended for that. So don't be discouraged if you yourself don't find that you are successful in your efforts, because ultimately you are only a piece of the puzzle. You know, you're one cog in the machine. Now, the last part is God's part. Can someone read John chapter 6, verse 44?
John 6:44.
Yes.
Okay. This is Jesus speaking, saying, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day."
Yeah.
The Father who sent me draws him.
Yes. You know, ultimately we could do what we can, but God, as we established with the FMC story before, God is sovereign. He's the one that's in control. He's the one overseeing everything. So no matter our efforts, we are not the one that will ultimately draw them to God. God will be the one to draw him to God. You know, we might be the catalyst, we might be the medium in which God does that, but ultimately we are God's tool. So unless God at that specific point in time is choosing to do that, then, you know, we just need to keep that in the back of our minds.
And I think it's interesting to, when you do disciple people, to be discerning as to kind of know when it's not the right time.
Oh, for sure.
This is not the right time. You know, maybe a year from now or 6 months from now, but this person is not, God has not worked in them to have them receive what we're saying. So you have to know when to kind of, you know, back off and say, okay, let's be
Just be an example.
Yeah, just be an example, yeah.
For sure. Because we may be a spiritual parent, but we weren't the one that conceived them spiritually. They were born again by the power of the Holy Spirit, right? So we have to keep that in mind, that even though we might be the spiritual parent in terms of practical categories, God is the one that conceived them. He's the one that brought them into this world, into this new life. And that they are ultimately a disciple of Jesus, right? For us as disciple makers, what's our goal? To make them our disciples, or to make them a disciple of Jesus? Like, you are, I think, I'm not going to even try to quote the verse, but ultimately the sentiment of the verse is, you are to imitate me as I imitate Christ,
Yes.
right? Like, I'm just transitive property. I'm B, I'm not A. A equals C, right?
It almost makes me think of like when Jesus says, I only do what the Father tells me to do.
Right.
You know, so he even has,
Yeah, he's the one that they're ultimately following,
yes.
right? And if there ever come a point where I'm doing something that is not reflecting Christ, then I would tell them, bypass me.
Yes.
Go straight to Christ.
Yes.
But eventually they should do that, right? Eventually they should do that. That ultimately they won't need to be so dependent upon you that they could go to Christ themselves and be like, I'm imitating Christ. And this is key for very specific reasons, that it helps us keep it in perspective that when it comes to success or failure, it's not fallen completely on our shoulders, which is why it can make the idea of discipleship a lot less daunting and more accessible to people. And I think that people would be more, I think, not to say that it should be easy, but I think they would come around more if they recognize that this is not a process that's in control in their hands. Because I think some people don't do it not just because they don't know, because it feels like it's too much pressure on them. So all we can really ask you to do is just be faithful to the process. That's it. So an intentional leader, they understand the nature of the game. You know, who the rules, the reason for doing it, who's involved. But now the coach has to evaluate the players. So switching gears, let me ask you this. How would you go about assessing the biological growth or development of a human being?
Just the visual, just seeing how they're growing, right?
You mean just like baby,
Yeah.
infant, toddler?
So clearly there would be like physical manifestations. They are literally growing in size,
Yeah.
right? So there's physical and mental manifestations. So what are some of the mental assessments that you would make in order to assess where they are in that, like, you know, you go to your doctor's office and you see that like chart, and you see that there are different like standards for certain stages of life, right? So physically, obviously, that's a lot more concrete. That's a lot more measurable. But what about mentally? How would you make those assessments on a biological level?
Like how quick they learn?
Yeah, how quick they learn. If you look at school, right, you could tell just by the fact that you have different math classes for each grade. With each year that passes by, you test their capabilities. You see what they can learn, what they can't learn. You test their limits, and from those tests and from those experiences, you can get a gauge of where they are in their mental development cycle.
I think from the quality of their questions.
Yes, that too. So critical thinking, right? Reading comprehension. The idea is you listen to what they say or notice because their questions might indicate how they think, or maybe how they see the world, especially in relation to them. It also highlights their priorities. You know, what do they think is important? What do they not think is important? What you realize has real life value to know all those things. So by similar means, we assess the growth in a person's spiritual life. We kind of do the same thing there. And why is that the case? I have 3 more verses I'm going to shoot out. Could I have a person read Matthew chapter 15, verse 18? Can I have a person read Luke chapter 6, verses 43 to 45?
Yeah,
And,
Matthew.
and can I have a person read James chapter 2, verse 18?
I'll take Luke. You got Matt? I'll take Luke.
I'll take James.
Okay, great.
And it was Luke 6.
Verses 43 to 45.
Got it.
And Matthew 15:18.
Yes.
Okay, Matthew 15:18. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person.
Yeah, and this was coming from the context where people were thinking, oh, it's the food that defiles you.
Mhm.
But no, Jesus is actually saying it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles you, because that is a reflection of what's going on in your heart. Now, Luke chapter 6, verses 43 to 45.
Sure. 43. For there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor, on the other hand, a bad tree which produces good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. Through 45.
Yes, please.
The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart.
Thank you. Now, James 2, that's the, faith is dead without works passage, but
But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. That's it, right? Show me your faith
yeah.
without deeds, sorry, and I will show you my faith by what I do.
Yeah, so we could have read that entire chapter, but just for the sake of time,
Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight that verse. So in other words, the best way to gauge a person's how a person is doing spiritually is to see what kind of fruit is being produced in their life. And we established last week that when a person is transformed by Christ, they are going to produce fruit. There's the fruit of the Spirit, as we indicate from Galatians 5. So, and fruit can come in the form of words and deeds, as we saw in these passages, in terms of providing insight in what's going on in a person's mind and their heart. So words and deeds are probably the most applicable and tangible expressions of what's going on inside a person. And it is by those in which we have the most information to kind of assess where they are spiritually. Now, we are going to get into this next section, which we're going to start looking at the categories. So there is a chart there that we're going to go over. But before we do, does anybody have any questions or comments up to this point? Okay, so when it comes to evaluating players, we need to clearly identify on a general scheme the stages of growth of a disciple. Now, there are different variations of this kind of chart that's out there online, but based on the source material, I found that this is one of the easiest ones to kind of interpret and to apply. So if you don't fully agree with everything, that's totally fine. I feel like there's no perfect scheme, but they all basically say similar things, especially when it comes to equating the spiritual life cycle of a person with a biological life cycle with a person. So we need to identify the stages of growth of a disciple, and we need to understand the basic characteristics and needs of each stage, as a real life parent would do. As nice as a thought as it may be, you would never expect an infant to change their own diaper. That's just not going to happen, right? So we need to be able to do that, and we do that we make assessments by recognizing key phrases, because we just talked about how words and deeds reflect what's going on in a person's heart and mind, reflect what stage of maturity they're at. So we notice what they say, and we notice what they do. And there are 5, and you do all this, once you make the assessment, and once you make the assessment, you help the person develop and move forward, because you have a better idea of what their next life stage would be. And there are 5 stages of spiritual growth that we're going to go over, which 5 stages of spiritual growth. I refer to page 5. I should have updated this. Wait, is page 5 for you the chart?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so that's great. All right. Yeah, so we're going to refer to page 5, and you can look at Appendix A for more information, because what's not on the chart are the needs of each stage. And that's very important. That's very key because the needs of the stage will kind of dictate in terms of practical things you would do with the person at each stage.
Okay, that's page 16.
Yeah, Appendix A.
Appendix A.
Yeah. Okay, but before we go, I'm going to throw out a disclaimer out there. So next to these categories are verses that help reveal their existence in Scripture, meaning that if you want to get a biblical basis for why is there an infant stage, why is there a child stage, why is there a young adult stage, why is there a parent stage, well, we've read some verses before that indicate that such stages they do exist in the Christian life. From the moment that you're born again to the moment that you are discipling others, there are intermediate steps in between, and those are some verses next to those categories on your outline that kind of help bolster that argument for those stages. And before we dive into each one of them, I did want to provide a word of caution, which was actually inspired by a conversation that I had at a small group earlier this past week. And it revolved around the idea of judging people. In today's culture, I think it's safe to say that judge has become a buzzword or a buzz concept, not just outside but inside the church as well. It is something that we don't want to find ourselves guilty of doing And when we make those assessments and put people in categories, it feels like we could be doing that. But here are some words from Putman's book, Discipleship, that you might find helpful, and I want them to set the stage for our mindset going into these categories. And it's this, quote, "In the church, we are taught not to judge people, and categorizing people into groups might feel akin to judging them. But that's not what we are doing. Judging implies that we are issuing a final verdict on their character or morality.
Yes.
Instead of condemning them or placing them in a category that they can't move out of, we are seeking to assess their level of spiritual maturity in order to help them move forward and grow." End quote.
It's just, I think it's the word to be used is not judging, it's discerning. I think
Right,
as
yeah.
a disciple or any kind of a leader, whether you're in business or in church, if you can't discern your audience and know your people, then you're not gonna have a good outcome as far as the group that you choose. So I don't personally see it as this as judging, I see it as discernment.
Yeah. And that's funny because that same word came up in that same conversation that we had in that small group. Don can attest to that what people think that we're doing as judging is probably not judging at all. It's, like you said, discernment. It's making calls about certain things. When we're called to sharpen others, how are we meant to do that? In order to sharpen someone else, we have to recognize that they're blunt in the first place, right? In order to not to say that we want to excommunicate people, but in order to excommunicate people, we have to make judgments and observations in the first place in order to get to that point. So we are called to make decisions all the time, and these decisions require wisdom and judgment, good judgment that's involved. Yes.
I would just definitely say like gentleness is like a part of discernment. Like it may seem like people might think you're judging them if you're like, I don't know, being like really harsh with your words, and maybe not being gentle to that person. Like maybe they can't take what you're saying. Like you can speak truth into somebody's life, but it doesn't have to be so like cutting edge. I think you have to know your audience, and I think that's where discernment comes in, where you can imply gentleness to that person, so you can show them like, hey, what you're doing is like not cool.
Yeah. And if we were wise, we would insert gentleness in there. I think that was part of the James 3 verse that I mentioned before about wisdom from above, right? Because I think what prompted that discussion was the "do not judge others" verse in passage in Matthew, where how are you to call someone out on a sin that they're doing when you yourself have a log in your own eye, which indicates that if you are a hypocrite, you're blind to your own spiritual weakness, and chances are you're not practicing wisdom, you're not practicing discernment, you're not fully aware of what God is doing at that moment. So who are you to, do this to someone else? So that's why.
I think that's different. That's like pointing out a sin. What we're talking about here is more just like discipleship of just discerning the person to know where they're at, so
Yes.
we know where we have to start, or where we can say, okay, you understand this, so let's start here. I think it's a totally different.
Yeah, that is the context of sin. Yes. Yeah, and obviously when it comes to discipleship, there is an aspect of discipleship where accountability, right? Vulnerability, truth.
Yes.
But yeah, you're right in that when it comes to this initial assessment, that's not what you're trying to do at all.
Yeah.
So I think for the benefit of the general reader, and because the word judgment has changed, the meaning of the word has changed over the years, right? So I think for Putman's audience, he's just trying to kind of diffuse that word for people, and I think that was the purpose here.
Yeah, I
But
understand.
I guess we're all good when it comes to that, so no need no need for diffusion. But anyways, as we move on to the next step, it might be helpful when it comes to shaping our perspective if we do the following. All right, we have specific categories: spiritually dead, infant, child, young adult, parent. Right, we have those categories there. Before we look at the actual description in the chart, it might be helpful to frame our mindset if we look at if we think about the expectations of their biological counterpart. Meaning, right? What would you expect of a dead person?
Nothing.
Yes, you would expect nothing. Exactly. What would you expect of an infant? What would you expect them to be able to do? What would you expect a child to do? Like, cry. Babble. Yeah, babble.
Eat, poop, sleep, that's what
Eat.
Rich said.
Well, that more infant, but child too. Child.
So right.
And then you move a little bit further in the years, a child might be a little bit more capable to do things on their own than an infant would, but at the same time, we know that they have a clear ceiling, right? So with that mindset, that should also help frame the spiritual categories as well. So just keep that in mind, because it's just funny how sometimes when we do ministry, we'll go to a non-believer thinking that they should totally understand where I'm coming from, when in reality, they are not. So when you try to have a gospel conversation with them and you think it's so obvious, well, to them it's not. So that's why I said sometimes it's helpful to think about the biological categories with counterparts to these spiritual categories to give you a better sense of frame of mind when it comes to approaching them.
I have a quick funny story. My
Yeah.
daughter, Stephanie, she was the first one to drive.
Yeah.
And all the other ones, like, after, just, like, we get in the car, we go to the big parking lot, I always let them drive a little beforehand, and I figured she kinda knew, she gets in the car, and she stops, and she goes, okay, what do I do? And I went, you're kidding me, right? Just like you said, I was like, you're kidding me,
Yeah.
right? She goes, I have no idea, I was like, and all the other ones after were like, you know what I mean? But she was like, what do I do? And I went, I really literally went, you're kidding me, right? And she said, no, I don't know what to do. I was like, all right, let's just back this up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, being your age, you would.
Yeah.
But here she was 17 that I figured,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like she has to know,
Yes.
but she didn't. She
Yeah.
just didn't.
You during that time you made an assessment based on certain expectations of her age, but
Yes.
clearly that was not the case. Not to say
Really.
that she's that way in all areas of life,
Yeah.
but at least for that very area,
Yes.
you know, she just didn't meet expectations.
Yes.
And then we have to have that mindset when it
Yes.
comes to being careful of how we talk to people, approach them, going forward. So let's look at the first category, spiritually dead. Just so I know that each of you will have gone through this completely, can I have a person read everything under the dead category?
That's hard to read.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Which one are we
Which
reading?
one, the appendix or the
Appendix.
chart?
The chart. Yeah, I know that.
The appendix,
Yeah, I
sorry.
couldn't alter the color. It was a PDF, so I'm sorry.
Oh,
So dead traits, they are broken, aware or unaware.
Mhm.
They are lost and unaware of it. They're living out their feelings. Phrases, they might say, I believe there are many ways to heaven. I'm a good person. I think there may be a higher power. I'm too busy for a small group. You want the bottom as well?
Yes, please.
People in the spiritually dead stage have not yet accepted Christ as Lord and Savior. They may completely reject God. They may be seeking God. They may be spiritual. They may even claim to know God or be a Christian, when in reality, they are their own God.
Yeah. So similar to what Sue said, when it comes to dead people, you don't expect anything. And in here, spiritual-wise, you really can't have any expectation that they would uphold any the Christian values, have any Christian knowledge, or anything like that. Or the fact of the matter is, maybe they do, but they do not have a relationship with Christ at this point in time. So yeah, go ahead, Rich.
The one thing I would say about this, the last clause, they are their own God.
Mhm.
I would say these guys are their own God all the time.
Mhm.
As you go up this ladder,
Mhm.
we are our own God less of the time, but we're still our own God much of the time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Unfortunately, right?
Yeah, I think that, and it's funny because you say that in that we think that our growth is going to be linear, right? But there will be seasons, there will be cycles where we will always fall back. We will always fall back, and that's because we are constantly fighting our sinful nature. Like you said, we will be less and less our own God. We'll be less and less self-centered. But the fact of the matter is, until we return to Him or He returns home, we will. It will always be an uphill battle. It will always be an uphill battle. Yeah, and as simple as this may seem, the idea is to kind of lay it out, to lay out the boundaries and the parameters, hopefully as clearly as they are, but we know in practical life, they are not always as clear.
Yeah.
Now for an infant, we talked about infant earlier, biologically they are poops, eats, sleeps, they can't do anything for themselves, although once they can crawl, they can definitely move where they want.
Yes.
But ultimately, they're utterly and totally dependent in terms of their needs. So, infant. Can someone read the infant in the chart? Okay.
They are the Lord of their life, confused about what truth is, or beginning to learn the truth. Phrases they might say are, Christians are hypocrites. I'm a good person. A loving God would never send me to hell. The church just wants my money. This is so common. I hear this a lot. I'm too busy for a small group. Spiritual infant. In this stage, people have accepted Christ but haven't moved much past that point. They can be new believers or they might be stagnant, long-time Christians. Life is generally all about them and their needs.
Now, did anyone notice anything interesting in that final description? Or did they find anything interesting about that
Well, they've
description?
accepted Christ at this point.
Yeah,
It can be new or long time
right.
Yeah.
in that category.
Yeah.
Define. It's not biological or how long you've been saved or how long you've been in quote in a
Right.
church.
Yeah, just because
It's about your growth.
just because you've been a believer so many years does not guarantee that you've reached a certain level of maturity. And the key concept for infants is that they don't know much, as we hear some of the common phrases that you might hear. Yes, they have a relationship with Christ, but beyond that, there isn't that much when it comes to their knowledge in terms of maybe biblical knowledge or practical application knowledge, theological practical application. They don't know necessarily yet at that point what it means to follow Jesus or what a life that follows him looks like. So they need to be guided. And they aren't aware of the ways that they need to change. So they need to be spoon-fed, which for infants you clearly do. You have to spoon-fed them.
That's a difficult stage though.
I'm sorry?
That's a difficult stage spiritually to disciple.
For sure.
Because a lot of times, they're not always willing. And that's, I guess, where you have to have that discernment to say, okay, maybe I need to back off here.
Yeah.
You know?
Because not all infants, they want to have their diapers changed at that time. They'll roll around. Not all infants,
Yeah, they do.
want to be fed at that specific point. They will,
Spit through that.
spit food out or knock the spoon away. So, yeah, it can be very difficult.
Yeah.
And now, a child. What would you think about when it comes to a child in the biological sense? So we're talking about, let's say, I don't know when an infant ends technically, but let's say from 2 years old to 17. what would you expect of them? Because legally, I feel like that's the case, right? Up to 17 or something like that. So
what's the question?
what would you expect from a biological sense of a child in their life? What can they do? What can they not do? What would you expect them to know? How would you expect them to approach life?
The way their parents teach them. Because at that point they're hopefully willing to learn. They're willing to rebel.
I would say more the way their parents show them and teach them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely.
You want to learn that.
I think they're growing more and more independent and being influenced from inside and outside the house and developing traits and characteristics and exercising their willful disobedience, and they're still very self-centered.
Yeah. And I think that you hit on a key thing there, in that they're still very self-centered. And the fact of the matter is, because they're more mobile, they're more vocal, they're more adept to acting, a lot of their self-centeredness comes out, especially during those years, whether it be prepubescent or their adult or their teenage years. Their self-centeredness comes out in those stages, and in that stage, very much so. At least with an infant, you can't hear them talk. They don't have the freedom to rebel, even if they want to. But a child, they have more capability to do that, and you will see that be the case. Now, for a young adult, what would you expect of a young adult on a biological level? Oh, did we even read child?
No, we didn't-
Okay, yeah, can we read child? Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Can someone read child for us? John, I know you have to leave.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah.
I'll read child.
Okay.
All right. Traits. They are growing in their relationship with God, building relationships with other believers, developing habits of Bible study and prayer, plugging into relational environments for the purpose of discipleship, such as small groups, giving of their time and money. Phrases they might say. I love my church because I feel like I belong. My small group is great. They make me feel welcome. I'm upset about having to branch out our small group. I just started making friends. And then finally down the bottom, spiritual child. In this stage, people are growing in their relationships with God and are also beginning to grow in their relationship with other Christians. They are applying God's word in their life and allowing others to walk beside them in their journey following Christ. However, it's still mostly about them, their needs, comfort, etc.
Thank you. So, as we can see that their actions, their words are a little bit more developed than those of an infant, clearly. And as Rich and Dom pointed out, that chances are they're mimicking what they're seeing from their parents. You know, for spiritual parents, you see what mature Christians do, and then you're trying to mimic them, even if you don't all quite fully understand why they're doing it. You know, because ultimately, as it says, as it shows from the phrases here, they're still doing it in relation to them. They're doing it because it is what's expected of them, or that's what they think, that I'm supposed to do this because this is what mature Christians do, but not necessarily as a, I don't want to say it's not a real manifestation of Christ working in them, but ultimately, as a child does something because they know it is the rule. It is what I'm supposed to do. My parents are telling me to do this, so I'm going to do it. You see them in these environments as well because that's what they're expected to do. They're being told to do this, but maybe not fully understanding why. So for a young adult, I don't think we touched upon this. So biological young adult, what would you expect?
Making decisions on their own,
Making decisions on their own.
maybe less influence from their parents.
Yes. A little bit more independent, a little bit self-sustaining, you know, self-sustaining, that maybe they need some guidance here and there, like,
Yes.
how do you do your taxes? Or,
Decisions and seeking wisdom.
yes, so even though they are much more developed than children, they still need to seek wisdom from others above them. As we see the uphill battle, right? You know, there's always going to be someone ahead of you, even though, you know, clearly there's a ceiling to this. But anyways, the idea is that a young adult is someone who's becoming more aware of the world around them, so they're becoming more other-centered, right? They're starting to make the transition from being self-centered to other-centered, or at least they should be. Because ultimately, if you think the world's about you, especially in the work world, that's not going to pan out very well. When you're interacting with others that are in their 20s and 30s and it's all about you, good luck in having people kind of stay in your circles. So when it comes to a young adult in a spiritual sense, can someone read that? Well, Damien, I haven't heard from you in a while. Can you read the young adult stage?
Yeah, they are becoming less self-centered and more other-centered, beginning to see themselves as ministers, tithing and giving their time from a place of thankfulness and love, understanding the kingdom purpose of branching their small group. Phrases they might say, I'm going to visit Bob in the hospital tonight rather than going to the movies. I'm serving in the nursery so that parents can attend the service. I need to branch my small group, but no one else is ready to lead. Spiritual young adult. In this stage, people are making a big shift from being self-centered to more other-centered. They're beginning to understand their role as a giver rather than a taker, ministering to others, putting others first, being doers of the word.
Thank you. So what are some trends that you see here when it comes to the young adult, if you were to summarize it?
Selfless, a bit more selfless.
A little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. Or, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's the right word.
Yes.
Being more intentionally sacrificial. You know, they're not being told necessarily, they don't have to be told to do certain things, and they just know that's something that they want to do. they seek to serve.
And I think the important thing when you're looking at this is that second part, they start seeing themselves as somebody that can minister to others.
Right.
That's important. It's a true sign of, maturity, not just, I need to minister, but now I'm gonna, like they said, sit in the toddler room so that the parents can go.
Right.
And I think it's important that they're doing it out of love and thankfulness,
Yeah,
not like you said, just because it's what is expected of them.
yeah.
Yeah. It's not just because it's not what expected of them. It's not because of how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
Right. That's gonna be that's not even gonna be in my like purview when it comes to why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And doers of the word.
Yes, doers of the word. Because that's a natural outflow of what Christ is doing. As you're maturing, as you're being more like Him, you start to realize that
It's not all
you're
about you.
not all about you, and you're starting to care about what Christ cared about. You're starting to reflect Him. Now, for parents, what would you expect in the biological sense?
Teachers.
Teachers. Gray hairs. worry. I mean, I'm speaking from my own parents' experience, so.
I think of like when I was young, everybody's family's dysfunctional, so at the time we were dysfunctional too. So when I looked at my family, I remember knowing something wasn't right, and I would look at other families. I remember looking at other families and going, oh, that's what it's supposed to be like. Or, oh, that's what it's supposed to be like.
Right.
Oh, that's what a dad should do, or that, and I was very young, so I never really came up with a final, evaluation or solution to the evaluating that I was doing,
Yeah.
but, I just think that if you don't have what is needed in a parent, generally speaking, you're really not sure. Do you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
As a kid, you're really not sure, well, what is it supposed to look like?
Yeah.
What are my parents supposed to be doing? You know?
I think the number one thing a parent should be is loving. And
Yeah.
They're gonna make a lot of mistakes. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
this just goes along with being human.
Yeah.
But if you have that love and the children feel secure in that love.
Yes.
And a lot of times even in the Bible, God says this and I think, would a loving God say that? And, but I trust
Yeah.
God as being loving, so.
So when we are tough, because we love them
Because
first,
we love
then
them
we
first.
trust that,
Yep.
this,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like what it says here, the phrases they might say, because they're pushing those they're spiritually parenting out to do their own thing. And those are the two things about parenting that my wife always drummed into my head. You need to give them a loving center and then encourage them to spread their wings.
Yep,
So
definitely.
they have the trust too,
Yeah.
because of that love.
I know you guys got your meeting, so if you go ahead. Yes, definitely for sure. So having said that, since Rich alluded to it, Rich, can you read that last column?
Parents, traits, they are mature disciples of Jesus, but continually growing and developing in their personal relationship with God and as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Skilled at assessing where others are in the discipleship process and get personally involved to help them grow and develop. Understanding their role as one who needs to intentionally invest in others, making disciples who can make disciples. Becoming a coach who develops other players and leaders. Phrases, I'm taking Steve with me the next time I visit Bob in the hospital to help him learn how to minister to others. I have a couple of good potential leaders in my home group that I'm going to personally invest in. Larry is a fine home group leader, and he has really matured in his faith. I'm going to ask him to pray about becoming a coach. A spiritual parent has a solid understanding of God's word and a deep, abiding relationship with the Father. They are living out God's word in their lives daily. They are others-centered and God-dependent. They are able to reproduce mature disciples of Christ by inviting others to follow them as they follow Christ.
The night that I was kind of interviewed here, the elders were asking me a question kind of to the sentiment of, what kind of how you describe a successful church, right? What kind of pastor would you want to be? And I said that I like to be the kind of pastor that if I was no longer here, the church would still be able to thrive without me.
Amen.
You know, like I do not want the church to be fully dependent on me. I would not want a church to crumble because I was not here, which means, because if it did, that means I did not do a good enough job. So I think ultimately a spiritual parent would seek the same thing for their kids, and that, because ultimately you're not always going to be in their life, right? You're not always going to be in their life in the biological sense or even in the spiritual sense. If it's true for the biological sense, it's true for the spiritual sense, right? In that you're not always going to be present in their life, but you want to know that they can still do what you do even if you're not around. That's what you want to impart upon them.
Yes.
And for those who are spiritual parents, they have that mentality. They have that desire. You know, sometimes there's those parents that don't want to let go of their kids, right? They're just
It's an unhealthy, it becomes such an unhealthy thing in both aspects. Because then you're like, it's just unhealthy.
I
Yeah.
raised my voice to be independent now, I'm sorry. I want them still.
But you did what you were supposed to do.
I know. But
Yeah, Rich?
that's it.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then when it comes to these categories, so feel free to read the chart at your own leisure or whatnot, but they're there for your benefit. And I think it's also helpful when it comes to, if you're ever discipling someone, you could show them this is the roadmap. These are the destinations that we're going through. So keep this in mind that, you know, when we hit this milestone, great, congratulations. All right, now we have this next thing. So, like I said, it looks linear, but often it could be cyclical. But another key thing when it comes to this chart that you have is that you notice the different people at different stages and how there's a rope linking all of them, which indicates that there are interactions ahead of you and behind you. You're either pulling someone with you or you're being pulled with someone.
Yeah.
And the idea of interactions means that there are relationships that are involved. Relationships are needed for this discipleship process to happen. And as we saw earlier, that when it comes to intentional leader, what do? They understand the nature of the game of discipleship. They evaluate the players. They also create relational environments to help this process go. Because ultimately, I don't think the example of the Jungle Book is going to happen every day. You know, where you have a young boy who's by himself in the wild. Oh, clearly we're going to be raised by the wolves. Clearly we're going to have interactions with the bear. No, that's not going to happen with us in real life in the context of the church. So how sad would it be if a person came one Sunday and they said, I want to accept Christ, but no one ever talked to them about it ever again? What are we to expect of them at that point? So that is something to keep in mind, that relationships are a key part when it comes to this. Yeah. I think it's FMC, man.
FMC? Did he say Griggs? Oh, I don't even.
Yeah, I think it's FMC. Yeah. But yes, relationships are super critical when it comes for discipleship happening. And when it comes to spiritual parenting, which we kind of alluded to this earlier, you can't have spiritual parenting without relationships. So commitment in time and commitment in proximity.
But I find that sometimes with, being a small group leader like Lynn, there's so many different women in my group and there's so many different personalities. And, I wish I had time to disciple those that really need that one-on-one. And of course my work is not allowing me to do that, but I wish I could with a couple of them. And I'm finding that the ones that are always really quiet and the ones that don't share, that's their personality. But I just feel it's hard to, if you're not doing a one-on-one with them, to show them that, you're still a disciple of Christ, even though he's giving you the personality he's giving you. You're still a disciple of Christ, and it's okay to share how you feel, and it's okay. But you know what I'm saying? I'm just thinking that it's sometimes difficult with certain personalities, they think because I can't do that, or I'm not that good, like they're off the hook to disciple. And we've doing James, so I've been really like, there's no excuse, if you're a follower of Christ, we're all disciples.
Right.
Whatever the excuse you give is not good enough, we're all supposed to be, talking about Christ to others, period.
And hopefully your influence will make a big difference.
Well, you can hope, but I'm just saying that I just think sometimes it's difficult, because people are very hooked into, well, this is how I am, and
Yeah.
I can't do that, or I can't do this. Well, no, you really can.
Yeah.
No, you really can.
And sometimes it takes extra effort and time to cultivate that out of them. You know?
Yes,
So-
yes,
But you gotta use discernment in terms of, okay, am I being spread too thin? You know, like
yes.
how's the best way to do that?
I know,
So
I know.
always
I have to
that's
be careful
always
about that,
yeah.
because there are a couple of people that I would really
Well,
like to.
What you say goes to the first thing about being a great leader is know the people.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And the second thing, and these are the things you mentioned first, and know the mission.
yeah,
So if you know the mission is to get everybody to here,
Mhm.
you know that you have people here, here, and here,
Yeah.
and you gotta get the one at A to B, and the ones at C to D,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
on and so forth.
yeah,
And that's what you have to do when you manage a team.
Yeah.
Basically, you have to know where they are, give them tasks that will move them up,
Mhm.
and make sure there's somebody that can replace you
Yep.
if it comes to that.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's what you're doing, and that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So hopefully maybe it doesn't have to be you that has that
Yes.
one-on-one with someone else. Maybe someone who's
Yeah.
on the cusp
yeah.
of spiritual parenthood.
Exactly.
Maybe they need a kid, right? Maybe they need a
Yeah.
kid, and maybe they're not ready for an infant, right? But maybe they could take on a child.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
those are all these assessments that you
Yes.
can potentially make with this.
Yes,
But obviously, like you said, it comes with prayer and it comes with
Yeah, it
wisdom.
comes with prayer.
it really does,
So,
yeah.
as a
Or
last
the
piece of
prayer
this,
that we want.
Because we're running out of time, you have a blank piece of paper. So you have a blank piece of paper. Take a minute and write down what category you think you're in.
Oh,
And-
yeah,
and-
that's difficult for me,
and-
because I see me in different categories. You know?
Depends on the time of the
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess so
Generally,
predominant.
predominantly
What would you say is the predominant? Because you know in terms of like your mindset on a 24/7 basis.
Yeah,
You know, even though you're not in vocational ministry, you know what your mindset is. You know where your time goes, right? So, what category do you feel like you fall in for the most part, and how long do you think you've been in that category? I mean, this would have been a much more effective exercise if we had more people here, but
Yeah,
you know,
I would
Long,
say
huh?
too.
Are you wanting us to share this?
no. So actually, I did this exercise, so it's there for your own benefit. You
Yeah.
see your own assessment in your own writing,
Yeah.
and you know how long you've been there,
Yeah.
and now you know what's your next stage.
Yeah.
So wherever you're at.
Well, that's a good question, how
So-
long have you been there? That's a good question.
Like if you've been in the church for 20 years, but you feel like you're at the child stage,
Yeah,
maybe hopefully that's an eye opener for you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like I said, I don't expect anyone here to be in that stage, but if we have more people, then maybe someone might have a light bulb, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm gonna close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time of getting together to talk about discipleship. I just pray that with what we learned about the spiritual stages of growth, that we can use that for your glory, use that to edify others and to help others along on their uphill battle when it comes to just becoming believer and follower of Jesus Christ, being more Christ-like. So we just thank you again for this time. May you bless our hearts as we come to service, as we celebrate everything that's happening, and may we give you the glory that you deserve. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.